Another story over the weekend in Barron's. Ron Barron was interviewed. He said that the most attractive time of this is the most attractive time of his lifetime to be an investor. Would you agree with that?
Well, no, but I would say it's among the more attractive. But 1974, the stocks were far cheaper then. And incidentally, the best year the Dow, the S&P has ever had in my investing lifetime was a year of recession. In 1954, people don't remember these things, but so you don't want to not buy stocks just because business is lousy at the time. That may be the very best time to buy stocks. In 1954, the Dow was up 50%, and the country was in a recession. It was the best year I ever had in my life, and I've had other good years in recession. So you don't want to say it's a big mistake to say business is bad, therefore I shouldn't buy stocks. That usually is the time to buy stocks, and when everything is wonderful, it's not usually a very good time to buy stocks. But I don't know when it'll turn. And the unemployment number, the job layoffs this month, the report we get about last month, it's an interesting statistic, but it will not tell you what's going to happen in the following months.
What do you watch? If the jobs number is sort of a backward-looking or a lagging indicator, what's the number that you watch most closely out of all your lines of businesses?
Well, housing is so important. It led us into this. It was the housing bubble that pricked a lot of other bubbles, but it was a huge bubble. I'm very interested in something like housing starts, because we're going to form maybe 1,300,000 households a year, and they're going to live someplace. Mm-hmm. And if we're building 2 million houses a year, we're going to have trouble down the road. That's exactly what we were doing a few years ago. If we're building 500,000, we're eating up that inventory, and the faster we eat up that inventory, the better off we are. That's why it's really not a good idea to have any big premium to induce people to buy new houses. We don't need new houses. We need to move the houses we've got around. When that gets done and we hit equilibrium, the world will change in a big way.
Joe?
Thanks, Beck. Mr. Buffett, I think a lot of business people take some solace, I guess, when you talk to President Obama, talk to his people. And President Obama, I think, appreciates your support during the election and uses your name at times to say, well, Warren Buffett, we've talked to him about things and he agrees with how we feel on this. But then there was a time when he mentioned Wells Fargo and he said, well, Warren Buffett has a big investment in Wells Fargo. And I'm just wondering, do you still talk to the president on things? Have you spoken to him since the election?
I've waved at him once or twice at public events, and I've spoken to him once.
Do you feel like you're a confidant on?
I'm sorry, Joe. I'll correct that. You said since the election. I've spoken to him more often than that since the election. I've spoken to him once since he was in office.
When you disagreed with him on maybe trying to do too much cap and trade or whatever, or the Wells Fargo comment is one that sticks in my mind. When he said, well, Warren Buffett has a big investment in Wells Fargo, maybe implying that you were talking your book when you were talking about the banks. Did that cause any consternation in you at that point?
I don't think I'll ever talk about what I talk with the president about, but I will confirm I had one conversation with him. But the truth is, we do have a big investment in Wells Fargo. I've owned Wells Fargo since 1991. I'll own it probably 5 or 10 years from now. So it doesn't really make any difference to me whether Wells Fargo stock goes up or down in a day or a week or a month. It's enormously important to me how they conduct their business, and I think they've done an incredibly good job of running their business. They've got the lowest cost money in the country. They've got the greatest community banking system that the world's ever seen, and incidentally, when the government needed to do something with what was probably the 4th largest bank in deposits with Wachovia, they transferred it over to Wells Fargo, and they didn't have to put up a dime of guarantees or money by the FDIC. So the government obviously had to think pretty well of Wells Fargo at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Carl?
Mr. Buffett, I was just wondering, you mentioned this issue of prioritization of debt, which is a huge issue. And as you know, the Congress is dealing with this issue of cram down, which basically allows bankruptcy courts to rewrite the prioritization of debt. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. It seems to me that following up on your basic theory there, cram down would undermine the prioritization of debt substantially.
Well, if I were lending money on in any form, but certainly if I were lending money in housing, and I have seen courts unilaterally change the amount of the debt, I would be a little more careful about how I lent money. So any time you get involved in the sanctity of contracts, you're going to make people more reluctant to engage in those contracts in the future, and you're going to make those kind of contracts more expensive because somebody has to build in the cost of legislation or a court later fooling around with them.
Well, of course, that was the point made by Daniel Webster in the Dartmouth College case, as I recall. So I think that's nice to hear.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I've got authority on my side someplace.
Hey, Carl? Hey, Warren, one last question. I don't want to give you too hard of a time about the op-ed about the op-ed that you wrote in the Times last fall, but we all remember it. Buy American, I am. I wonder if you stand by what you wrote, first of all, and second, if you felt any personal obligation or responsibility to talk people off the ledge at the time. If any part of that was you trying to do some greater good, if that makes any sense?
No, I was saying what I was doing, and I said I don't know what the stock market's going to do in a week or a month or a year, but the truth is that I did feel that equities over a 10-year period were almost certain to beat a policy of buying either 10-year bonds or buying short-term bonds and continuing to roll them, which a lot of people were doing. So I thought people were following foolish policies if they really were committed to buying, like I say, either the 10-year government or buying short-term bonds and rolling them, because they were going to lose purchasing power over time, and equities were going to do fine over time. Had no idea what they do in the short term, but and I would still do. I still say the same thing.
I was going to ask that as we got into March and we saw some of those lows. Did that make you feel even more strongly about those positions?
Oh, sure.
Did you continue buying?
The cheaper things go, the better I like it. I mean, if I could buy the whole American economy at 3/4 of X instead of X, I feel better off. And particularly when I compare it with rolling, Treasury bills at 1/4% or 0.5%, or buying the 10-year at 3%. I know buying the 10-year at 3% is not going to work out very well in terms of purchasing power. I know that rolling Treasury bills is not going to work out in terms of purchasing power. And I think I know that if you buy the American economy at 60% of what it was selling for a few years ago, and you get a cross-section of companies that aren't highly leveraged or something of that sort, you're going to do well.
Does that mean that as we got into March, you stepped up or continued your buying, either in your personal portfolio or through Berkshire?
The cheaper things have become the more I've wanted to buy, yeah.
And
now, if I run out of gas, I run out of gas.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. In terms of how much cash you have on hand to be able to do those things?
No, if McDonald's reduces the price of hamburgers today, I'm going to feel good even though I bought hamburgers at a different price yesterday. I mean, I'm going to be buying hamburgers every day for the rest of my life, and the cheaper they get, the better I like it. Now, if there's nothing wrong with American business over the long term. I mean, the conditions that made it wonderful continue to. The Dow Jones average started the 20th century at 66. It ended at 11,400. We had a Great Depression, world wars, all kinds of things in between. It doesn't work perfectly every day, but it works over time.
One thing you are not going to be getting cheaper is your New York Times. There's a story in the Financial Times today talking about how the New York Times is expected to raise its newsstand prices to $2 from $1.50 during the week and to $6 from $5 on the weekend. Do newspapers have a future? You've got a stake in Washington.
Unfortunately, they don't. I love newspapers, but if the New York Times is going to sell for $2 in the print edition and be free on the internet, that's a very unsustainable model over time. And I still read the print edition because I like to, but if I were a young person making some lesser sum, why wouldn't I go to the internet and read it free rather than pick up the print edition? So they're going to have to answer that at some point, and so far it hasn't been answered.
But you still are keeping your stake in the Washington Post.
Yeah, I've had the Washington Post stock since 1973, so I'm in there for keeps, and they have a good educational business. They had a good cable TV business, but newspapers. I mean, if Mr. Gutenberg had come up with the internet instead of movable type back in the late 15th century, And for 400 years, we'd use the internet for news and all kinds of entertainment and everything else. And then I came along all of a sudden today and said, I've got this wonderful idea. We're going to chop down some trees up in Canada, and we're going to ship them to a paper mill, which will cost us a fortune to run through and deliver newsprint. And then we'll ship that down to some newspaper. And we'll have a whole bunch of people staying up all night writing up things. And then we'll send a bunch of kids out the next day all over town delivering this thing. And we're going to really wipe out the internet with this. Yeah, it isn't going to happen.